The Hürtgen Forest had a way of making a man wonder if the war had been planned by someone who never stepped off a road. Out in the open country you could at least see the trouble coming. Here, the trouble lived inside the trees, and it arrived by sound first: distant guns, the soft, tearing crack of airburst shells chopping branches, the steady hiss of rain working into every seam of a uniform. The forest was dense enough to feel like a ceiling. Even at midday the light was weak and green, filtered through pine needles and smoke. The ground below was a churned slurry that clung to boots and tires with the same stubbornness, a mixture of clay and rotting needles that could swallow a wheel to the hub if a driver hesitated at the wrong moment. The Americans called it green hell, and for once the nickname didn't feel like exaggeration so much as a warning label. You could be brave and still disappear into it. You could be careful and still get killed by a fragment you never saw. The strangest thing, the thing no one admitted out loud, was that the forest didn't feel like a battlefield at all. It felt like machinery, an enormous, wet, grinding machine that turned men and vehicles into wreckage in slow increments. It was in that machinery that Private First Class Daniel Kerr found a role he hadn't expected when he'd learned his trade back in a stateside motor pool. He wasn't a man who talked about fear the way some men did, as if naming it could keep it away. Kerr carried it quietly, in the way his hands moved over metal and rubber, in the way he listened to engines like they were breathing. He'd come over as a mechanic, a junior wrench in a unit that needed every truck running and every jeep able to take the road. In the Hürtgen, mechanics became drivers because everybody became whatever the situation demanded. When convoy schedules tightened and replacements didn't keep pace with the losses, someone with steady hands and an eye for failure points was suddenly behind a steering wheel, threading a thin-skinned vehicle between shell holes and fallen timber. Kerr's Jeep was a standard-issue vehicle on paper, but it wore a field-made reinforcement that looked like it had been scavenged from a scrap pile, angular braces welded near the front, a rough guard around the vulnerable underside, extra metal where shrapnel tended to bite. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't official. It was simply his answer to a question the forest kept asking. What breaks first when everything is wet, cold, and being hunted? The other men saw it and laughed because laughing was cheaper than admitting they wanted the same protection. Someone called it Kerr's garbage armor. Another joked that he'd built himself a junkyard tank. The ridicule wasn't cruel in the way civilians imagine cruelty. It was the tired, automatic kind that floated through a motor line where nobody had slept properly in weeks. It was also a way of policing hope. Hope was dangerous here. It made you careless. The officers wanted standardization, predictable maintenance, and no surprises. The drivers wanted anything that might keep them from getting stranded under fire. Kerr's reinforcement sat right in the middle of that tension, a physical reminder that doctrine and survival weren't always on speaking terms. He didn't answer the jokes. He tightened bolts. He checked his oil. He touched the welds with his thumb, feeling for the hairline fractures that cold could hide. If the metal held, it held. If it didn't, the forest would teach him quickly. Convoy duty in the Hürtgen was not glamorous. It was repetition under threat, a long sequence of small decisions that could become fatal. Trucks idled in staggered lines while infantry escorts hunched in their coats, helmets low, faces gray with fatigue. Rations and ammunition were stacked and lashed down with the care of men who understood that a spilled load could mean hours of delay on a road that might not give them hours. The air smelled of wet canvas, diesel, and the faint metallic tang that always seemed to hang after shelling. On the maps, the routes were simple, thin lines through woodland toward units pressing against concrete and wire. On the ground, those lines were mud-choked tracks cut by craters and hemmed in by trees so close that a driver could brush bark with an elbow. The enemy didn't need to hit a truck directly to ruin a convoy. A burst in the canopy could drop splinters the size of knives and smash radiators like glass. A mine could flip a vehicle sideways and block the road for everything behind it. The convoy's real enemy was stoppage. Once you stopped, you became a target that couldn't move. Kerr understood that in a way that went beyond tactics. He understood it in the language of mechanics. Momentum was life and breakdown was death. By the time the column rolled out, the forest had already begun its work. Mud clung to tires and heavy slabs. Exhaust smoke drifted between trunks and hung there, trapped by the damp air. Kerr drove with his shoulders tense, not from bravado but from the constant calculation of traction, clearance, and distance. The reinforcement rattled softly under him, a stubborn, unmusical sound that reminded him it was there. He could hear laughter from earlier in the day still echoing in his mind, but it felt far away now. The Hürtgen reduced everything to immediate needs. Keep moving, keep spacing, keep the road open. As the convoy disappeared into the trees, the Jeep's ugly steel braces looked less like a joke and more like a confession. That in this place you didn't survive by being impressive. You survived by being prepared for what the forest always did: take the weak points first. The ambushes began the way most real ambushes begin, not with a dramatic signal, but with a small wrongness that only makes sense afterward. A convoy would be moving steady, engines low, drivers staring down the muddy corridor, and then a single explosion would bloom under the lead truck or just off the shoulder where a tire had drifted an inch too far. The sound wasn't cinematic. It was a brutal, flat concussion that turned mud into spray and slammed everyone's chest like a hammer. The first seconds were always confusion. Men leaned forward as if their eyes could do what the trees refused: show them where the danger lived. Then rifle fire cracked from the tree line, sharp and controlled, and sometimes the deeper cough of a machine gun from a concealed position. The enemy didn't need to destroy every vehicle. They only needed to stop the column in the narrowest stretch, then let artillery and small arms do the rest. In the Hürtgen, the road was a funnel, and the convoy was the water forced through it. Kerr began to notice patterns the way a mechanic notices a recurring failure. It wasn't always the same bend or the same rise, but it was always the same kind of terrain. Places where the road narrowed between embankments, where fallen trunks lay close enough to force vehicles into predictable tracks, where visibility shortened to a few truck lengths. The enemy used observation like a tool. Somewhere out there, often unseen, someone watched for movement and the faint glow of headlights under mist, then fed coordinates to guns that could reach through the trees. When artillery came, it came as bracketing, a methodical walk of impacts that told you the enemy wasn't guessing. Shells would burst in the canopy and the forest would rain down shattered wood like thrown gravel. The trucks, heavy and stubborn, would try to push forward, but a single disabled vehicle could pin everything behind it. Drivers who had crossed France in confident columns now sat white-faced, hands locked on steering wheels, listening for the next hit and wondering if the road behind them was already mined. The officers reacted the way officers often do when the world refuses their plans. They issued tighter schedules, stricter spacing, more escorts, more warnings. They demanded reports written in cramped pencil on wet paper, then asked why the reports didn't stop the casualties. Morale tightened like a belt pulled one notch too far. Men stopped talking about home because home felt like a rumor. They talked about road conditions, about which unit got hit last, about how long it took to clear a wreck before the next shelling started. Kerr kept his head down and worked. When the convoy halted to let engineers probe for mines, he walked his jeep's perimeter and checked the reinforcement points, feeling the cold metal, looking for fresh scars. The garbage bracing did what it was meant to do, not by making the jeep invulnerable, but by making it less fragile in a place that punished fragility. Where another jeep might have taken a shard through a radiator or lost steering linkage to debris, Kerr's vehicle came back with dents and gouges that looked ugly but stayed functional. It wasn't a miracle. It was an incremental advantage, the kind that didn't show up in grand communiques but mattered in the wet arithmetic of survival. The ridicule began to soften, not because anyone apologized, but because men started asking practical questions. Where did you get the steel? How much did it weigh? Did it make repairs harder? Kerr answered with the same economy he used on the road. Scrap came from wrecked vehicles and abandoned farm implements. Weight was a problem, but being immobilized was worse. Repairs were harder, but repairs were always hard in the Hürtgen, where tools went missing in mud and hands lost feeling in minutes. The drivers who had laughed now watched his jeep roll through debris-choked stretches without stalling, watched it take the punishment of sudden potholes and splintered branches without cracking the vulnerable parts. Officers still frowned because unofficial modifications were a headache, but headaches were preferable to casualty lists that kept growing. In a battle defined by attrition, anything that reduced breakdowns reduced exposure, and reduced exposure meant fewer dead men on the road. That logic didn't require anyone to admit they'd been wrong. It only required them to keep moving. The forest, meanwhile, kept its own counsel. Weather turned from rain to sleet and back again, icing the mud into slick plates that stole traction without warning. Tires spun, then caught, then spun again, throwing filth like shrapnel. Kerr drove with his jaw clenched, eyes scanning for the subtle signs of mines, disturbed earth, unnatural lines, a place where water pooled too neatly. Every convoy run felt like the same story told with different details. men pushing forward into a corridor the enemy had studied longer than they had occupied it. The ambushes didn't make the Americans feel outmatched in firepower so much as outmatched in familiarity. The forest belonged to the defenders. The convoy was an intrusion, noisy and visible. Kerr's reinforcement did not change that truth. It only made his jeep better suited to survive it long enough to be useful, and in the Hürtgen, usefulness was the closest thing to heroism most men ever saw. The sleet came in sideways, driven by wind that found every opening in a coat and turned damp fabric into something that felt like ice. Late afternoon light failed early under the trees, and by the time the convoy reached the worst stretch of road the world had narrowed to headlights swallowed by mist and the dull glow of cigarette tips cupped in gloved hands. The column moved slow, each truck keeping distance by instinct more than discipline, because the road itself punished spacing. It was rutted deep, edged with ditches that could trap a wheel, and lined with broken pine that leaned inward like snapped spears. Kerr's jeep ran near the front, not because he wanted glory but because the front was where breakdowns became blockages. A mechanic understood bottlenecks the way an infantryman understood fields of fire. In the Hürtgen, a disabled lead vehicle was not just a vehicle. It was the beginning of a slaughter. The first mine went off under a truck that had drifted a fraction too far to avoid a crater. The blast lifted the front end and slammed it down crooked, rupturing something vital. The engine screamed once and died. For a heartbeat the convoy froze in collective disbelief, as if stillness could keep the next thing from happening. Then rifle fire cracked from the left tree line, sharp and close, and the right side answered with the deeper chatter of a machine gun, bullets slicing through sleet like sewing needles. The escorts dismounted into mud and took positions behind wheels and engine blocks that offered only the illusion of cover. Kerr felt the impact of fear in a physical way, a tightening of the throat, a hardening of the hands around the wheel. He didn't have to look at the trucks behind him to know what was happening. They were bunching. Drivers were trying to reverse in a narrow corridor with no room and no visibility, their tires digging in, their tailgates nearly touching. That was what the ambush was meant to do. Panic the column into becoming a single, immobile mass. Artillery followed, not as a random storm but as a bracketed pattern. Shells burst in the canopy and the forest answered with falling timber and splinters that hissed through the air. The noise was not one noise but many, truck engines revving, men shouting warnings, metal clanging as loads shifted, the wet smack of rounds hitting mud, and above it all the steady tearing sound of tree bursts shredding branches. Kerr drove forward because stopping meant dying. His reinforced jeep took the first shower of fragments with a harsh, ringing sound as steel was struck and deflected. Something hit the underside hard enough to jar his teeth, but the guard held and the engine stayed alive. A standard jeep might have been crippled by that single strike, oil pan punctured, radiator cracked, steering knocked loose. Kerr's field-made bracing did not prevent damage, it prevented the kind of damage that turned a moving vehicle into a dead one. He felt the vehicle shudder and kept it steady, guiding it around the disabled truck's front end where the road narrowed to a strip of churned mud between ditch and embankment. He wasn't thinking about being brave. He was thinking about angles and clearance. He was thinking about the way tires climbed over broken boards and how a differential could snag on a stump. He edged the jeep past the wreckage and into the space ahead, where the enemy fire was still coming but the road was momentarily open. Behind him, a truck driver tried to force his vehicle backward and jackknife it, blocking half the track. Kerr cut his wheel and used his jeep like a shepherd's crook, moving where he could be seen, signaling with his arm in broad, urgent motions to keep vehicles aligned, to keep them from locking the whole column. The sleet stung his face. The air smelled of cordite and wet pine sap. A wounded man stumbled near the shoulder and fell, and two others dragged him behind a wheel well as bullets snapped into the trees above. Kerr's jeep took another hit, metal ringing, a jolt through the frame, and still it moved. That movement was everything. It meant he could reach the next truck, pull a line, tow a vehicle a few yards to clear a path, give the convoy a chance to uncoil instead of nodding into a target. The ambush did not end with sudden triumph. It ended the way many fights end in the Hürtgen, by exhaustion, by incremental withdrawal, by the enemy shifting fire to new coordinates and the Americans clawing their way out of the trap in pieces. When the column finally began to move again, it did so with the slow, careful coordination of men who had learned that speed without control was just another way to die. Kerr's jeep rolled on, dented and scarred, with mud packed into every corner and sleet freezing on the hood in thin sheets. The men who had laughed at his garbage reinforcement didn't cheer. They didn't clap him on the back. They looked at the battered metal and then at the road ahead with the same sober expression, and something in that look shifted. It wasn't admiration. It was recognition of a small advantage that had mattered when everything else had gone wrong, and of how little the forest cared about pride. Afterward, the convoy world adjusted the way a frontline world always adjusts, quietly, practically, and without much ceremony. There were no official memos praising field ingenuity. There were just men in motor lines looking at their own vehicles with different eyes, measuring weak points with the same grim attention they gave to their own bodies. Command began to pay attention not because it wanted to encourage unauthorized modifications, but because casualty rates and lost material forced attention. In the Hürtgen, the normal boundaries between what was permitted and what was necessary blurred every week. Engineers laid logs and planks across the worst mud holes to keep trucks from sinking, building rough corduroy stretches that rattled suspensions and shook teeth but allowed movement where the ground would otherwise swallow vehicles. Those makeshift roads were ugly and temporary and essential, just like Kerr's reinforcement. The forest demanded improvisation, and it punished anyone who waited for perfect solutions. Kerr didn't become a celebrity. He became useful in a way that made people stop wasting words on him. Officers asked him to show them what he'd reinforced and why. Drivers asked if he could help them do the same to their jeeps, their trucks, anything that had to keep moving under shell fire. The modifications spread not as a wave of enthusiasm but as a slow, reluctant imitation. Men scavenged steel from wrecks and abandoned equipment. They bolted plates where fragments liked to strike and braced frames that had been twisted by craters. Each vehicle that adopted the reinforcement became slightly more likely to return, and that likelihood mattered because returns meant the supply line stayed alive. It wasn't just ammunition and food that moved along those roads. It was morale, the fragile belief that the front could be sustained, that wounded men could be evacuated, that units could hold another day. When a convoy failed, everything at the forward edge felt it immediately. The narrative widened as winter deepened. Infantry escorts grew more disciplined, learning to anticipate where the enemy liked to strike, scanning the tree line for unnatural shapes, watching for wires and disturbed ground. Engineers and MPs tried to vary routes and timings, but the Hürtgen was a maze with only so many corridors that could bear weight. Artillery remained the constant presence, a threat that didn't need to be seen to be felt. Tree bursts were the forest's signature injury, and men learned to fear the canopy as much as the ground. The road itself became a front line, a narrow strip of contested space where logistics and combat fused into one ugly reality. Kerr's Jeep, with its patched armor and rattling braces, became a small emblem of that fusion. It wasn't built to fight. It was built to endure, and endurance was what the Hürtgen demanded most. As more vehicles adopted similar bracing, the convoys changed subtly. They stopped less often for breakdowns. They recovered faster from minor hits. They could push through debris that would have immobilized them before. The effect was not dramatic, not the kind of thing that turned the forest safe. It was the difference between a convoy halting in the open and a convoy limping forward to a bend where it could at least reorganize. It was the difference between a truck burning in the middle of the road and a truck shoved off to the side before it could block everything. Those differences accumulated into something like resilience. Kerr watched it with the detached satisfaction of a mechanic who sees a system become less prone to failure. He also watched the cost continue. Men wounded by fragments, drivers shaken by explosions, the slow attrition that made every new face in the unit look younger than the last. His reinforcement didn't erase that. It just made one small part of the machinery less likely to jam. In the Hürtgen, that was enough to matter. The forest still swallowed sound. It still trapped smoke. It still turned rain into cold that seeped into bones. But when convoys rolled, they did so with a slightly different posture. Still wary, still tense, but less helpless. The men who had once mocked Kerr's garbage steel now treated it like any other piece of kit that earned its keep. No one spoke of it with romance. They spoke of it the way soldiers speak of anything that works. With brief words, practical words, words that ended in action. The war was still larger than any single jeep. Yet in a battle where yards were paid for in blood and time, a field-made reinforcement that kept vehicles moving became part of the story whether anyone wanted it to be or not. The turning point did not arrive with a grand offensive banner or a cleanly defined day. It arrived as a convergence of pressure, orders that demanded more supply runs, weather that narrowed the margin for error, and an enemy effort to sever multiple routes at once. The forest roads, already strained, became arteries under attack. Convoys rolled out in quick succession, each one carrying the weight of units at the front that were burning ammunition and eating rations faster than the rear could deliver. The enemy understood the logic as well as the Americans did. Cut the road and you cut the fight. The ambushes became more coordinated, combining mines to force stoppages, small arms to pin escorts, and artillery to crush anything that couldn't move. In those moments, the reinforced vehicles didn't look like clever innovations. They looked like the difference between a column that could still function and a column that collapsed into wreckage. Kerr's Jeep and the others that had adopted similar bracing began to earn their value in the hardest way, by staying mobile when mobility was the only protection left. When a truck lost a wheel to a mine, a reinforced Jeep could still crawl forward through debris and reach it with a tow line without being disabled by the same fragments and flying splinters that would have stopped a lighter vehicle cold. When artillery bracketed the road, reinforced vehicles could push into the smoke and confusion to drag a damaged truck just far enough off the track to keep the column from freezing in place. That act, moving a wreck a few yards, keeping a gap open, didn't feel heroic while it happened. It felt like brutal labor under fire, boots slipping in mud, hands numb on cable, engines straining. The convoy's survival depended on those small acts because each prevented the chain reaction the enemy was trying to trigger. Panic, pileup, immobility, destruction. Over the span of those winter runs, the effect became measurable in the only way frontline men measure anything: by who came back. 23 convoys that might once have been shredded managed to survive engagements that would previously have ended with burning trucks blocking the road and rescue efforts stalled behind them. Saved did not mean untouched. It meant damaged vehicles recovered instead of abandoned. It meant wounded evacuated instead of trapped. It meant ammunition delivered with fewer days lost to road closures. The forest remained lethal. Men still died. But the adaptation blunted the enemy's advantage in a place where the enemy's advantage had been built on predictability and stoppage. A reinforced Jeep couldn't defeat artillery. It could, however, keep a column from becoming an easy, immobile target long enough for the escort to respond and for the convoy to uncoil and move. That was the kind of improvement that didn't change the war's outcome on a map, but changed outcomes for men who lived inside the map's thin lines. The psychological effect was subtle but real. Drivers began to believe not in invulnerability, but in the idea that the convoy could adapt. That belief mattered because fear without agency turns to paralysis. Fear with a procedure, with a tool, with a vehicle that was less likely to die under the first shower of fragments, became something else. Still fear, but fear that could be managed long enough to act. Officers who had once dismissed Kerr's reinforcement as unauthorized junk now treated it as a field expedient worth replicating. They did not praise him in speeches. They simply made room for the work, allocated scrap, and stopped asking why it wasn't in a manual. In the Hürtgen, the manual was written by shellfire and mud, and it revised itself daily. When the convoys rolled through the battered forest, the reinforced vehicles carried their scars openly, dents, gouges, twisted brackets hammered back into shape. Those scars became part of their identity. They were evidence that the vehicle had been in the corridor and had returned. Kerr looked at those marks the way he looked at worn tools, not with sentiment but with an understanding of cost. Each dent had been a fragment that might have opened an oil pan. Each scrape had been a branch that might have ripped a line. The forest still loomed, indifferent, waiting for the next column. But the convoys moved with a little more continuity than before, and continuity in a supply battle was a kind of victory measured not in captured ground, but in days endured. When the fighting in the Hürtgen finally eased and units shifted, the forest didn't look like a place that had been conquered. It looked like a place that had been ruined. The trees stood broken and blackened, their tops blasted away. The ground was scarred by craters filled with brown water that never seemed to drain. Wreckage lay where it had been abandoned. Twisted metal half sunk in mud, scattered crates, fragments of makeshift roads rotting into the earth. Men who left it carried the forest with them in small ways. A permanent flinch at sudden cracks, a memory of wet cold that returned in dreams, a bitterness at how costly each yard had been. The battle's meaning, debated later by historians and commanders, felt different to the men who had driven its roads. To them it was a long lesson in endurance and attrition, a reminder that war could be decided as much by logistics and terrain as by maneuver. Kerr's modified Jeep did not become a legend in official histories. It did not win medals on its own. It simply did what it had been built to do. Keep moving, keep the road from closing, keep small failures from becoming fatal stoppages. In the aftermath, that mattered most as absence. Fewer convoys wiped out in a single choke point, fewer drivers lost to preventable breakdowns under shell fire, fewer desperate recovery missions launched into the same ambush corridors. The men who had mocked the garbage reinforcement stopped thinking of it as garbage because the forest had corrected their judgment with a kind of ruthless clarity. The reinforcement wasn't beautiful, but it was honest. It admitted what the Hürtgen demanded: protection for the weak points, redundancy against chaos, and a willingness to solve problems without waiting for permission. In the end, Kerr returned to routine duties without ceremony, the way most soldiers did. He tightened bolts. He changed oil in freezing air. He listened to engines and learned new sounds as vehicles aged and parts wore down. The war moved on to other places. Open ground, towns, rivers, lines on maps that didn't look like a suffocating forest. Yet the Hürtgen stayed in the background as a kind of cautionary memory. It had been a battle where the enemy's strength wasn't just bunkers and guns, but the environment itself. Mud that stopped vehicles, trees that turned shells into airbursts, narrow roads that made every convoy a predictable target. Kerr's field modification did not change those realities. It simply offered a small counterweight, a practical adjustment that preserved lives not through drama, but through reduced failure. What remained, when the noise faded, was the quiet understanding that wars are not only fought by rifle companies and tank battalions. They are fought by drivers who keep columns moving in darkness, by engineers who lay logs under fire, by mechanics who refuse to accept that a flimsy vehicle must remain flimsy just because a manual says so. In places like the Hürtgen, where victory was measured in yards and paid for in men, survival often came down to the smallest decisions: where to add steel, when to stop, how to keep a road from becoming a grave. Kerr's reinforcement was one of those decisions made visible in metal, and its value was written not in a citation, but in the convoys that came back out of the trees when, by all prior patterns, they should not have.